She cried more beautifully than anyone in Hollywood. But when Jane Wyman cried at home, for a dead child, a failed marriage, a life reduced to footnote, there was no applause, only silence. She gave Hollywood its most haunting silence and won an Oscar for it. Then she spent 60 years living in silence herself, shielded, erased, defined by others. I won an Oscar for a role where I didn't speak. My whole life felt the same. Jane Wyman said this years after her triumph, and the words carried a weight that went beyond Hollywood irony. She'd spent a career playing women who suffered beautifully, who cried exquisitely, who endured with grace. But the real suffering, the dead daughter, the failed marriages, the decades of being introduced as Ronald Reagan's ex-wife, even though she was the one with the Oscar, that suffering happened in silence. Hollywood applauded her tears on screen, but no one clapped when she cried at home. March 24th, 1949. The 21st Academy Awards at the Academy Award Theater in Hollywood. Jane Wyman sat in her seat wearing a simple black gown, her face composed, her hands folded. When they called her name for Best Actress, for Johnny Belinda for playing a deaf-mute farm girl who is raped, gives birth, and fights to keep her child, she walked to the stage with the same quiet dignity that had defined her performance. She accepted the statue, thanked the necessary people, and said something that would echo through the rest of her life. I accept this award for Belinda, who could not speak for herself. The audience applauded. The cameras flashed. Jane Wyman had arrived at the pinnacle of Hollywood success, the first and only time a performer would win an Oscar for a role entirely without dialogue, a performance so powerful that silence became its own eloquence. But in the midst of that triumph, something else was ending. Her marriage to Ronald Reagan, already strained by his growing obsession with politics, and her grief over their daughter's death 2 years earlier, was falling apart. Within months they would be divorced, and Jane would become a footnote in another person's story. The ex-wife of the man who would become president rather than the artist who had achieved something extraordinary in her own right. Silence can be a shield, and sometimes a prison. She would say this too, years later, and perhaps only Jane understood how the same quality that protected her, the refusal to explain, to justify, to publicly grieve or complain or defend herself, also trapped her in a narrative written by others. The silent queen of Hollywood melodrama, living her own melodrama in silence, never quite able to speak for herself any more than Belinda could. Is it possible to win the highest honor your profession can offer and still lose everything that matters? Can you be recognized for portraying suffering and still have your own suffering go unrecognized? And when you choose silence as protection, as dignity, as a way to survive, at what point does that silence become indistinguishable from erasure? If you win an Oscar for playing voiceless and then spend 60 years being voiceless about your own story, is that strength or is that tragedy? She wasn't born Jane Wyman. She was born Sarah Jane Mayfield on January 5, 1917 in St. Joseph, Missouri, into circumstances she would spend her entire career hiding. Her father abandoned the family when she was young. Some accounts say he left before she was born. Others that he died when she was 4, and Jane herself gave different versions at different times, as if the truth was too painful to claim consistently. Her mother couldn't care for her alone, so young Sarah Jane was sent to live with neighbors, essentially raised by people who weren't family, who took her in out of charity or obligation rather than love. This was abandonment, though nobody called it that. This was being orphaned while both parents still lived, being given away because you were inconvenient, being raised by strangers who reminded you daily that you weren't really theirs. Young Sarah Jane learned early that you couldn't count on anyone, that family was a fiction, that survival meant learning to need nothing from anyone because needing meant eventual disappointment. She discovered performing as a way out, Local talent shows, small roles, anything that might lead somewhere beyond Missouri, and the constant reminder of not being wanted. She changed her name to Jane Durrell, then Jane Wyman, creating a new identity as if the old one could be discarded like clothes that no longer fit. She lied about her age, her background, her experience, whatever it took to get noticed, to get hired, to get out. Could this early abandonment, being given away because you were inconvenient, learning that family was fiction and survival meant needing nothing from anyone, have created both Jane's incredible resilience and the emotional fortress that would define her entire life? When you learn as a child that nobody wants to hear about your suffering, that expressing need leads only to disappointment or rejection. Do you ever learn to speak about pain, even when someone finally asks? Or does silence become so ingrained that it's no longer a choice, but simply who you are? The person who endures everything alone because alone is the only safety you've ever known. By the late 1930s, Jane had made it to Hollywood, though not in the way she'd dreamed. She was a chorus girl, a bit player, the pretty blonde in the background of musicals. Warner Brothers kept her under contract but didn't quite know what to do with her. She could sing adequately, dance well enough, had a pleasant face, but nothing that made casting directors take notice. She appeared in dozens of films with roles so small they barely registered, accumulating credits without accumulating recognition. Then she met Ronald Reagan. He was a young contract player at Warner Brothers like herself, good-looking, affable, charming in the effortless way that would later serve him well in politics. Not yet a star, but clearly headed somewhere, with ambition that matched hers and a smile that made everything seem possible. They met in 1938 on the set of Brother Rat, started dating and married in January 1940 in a small ceremony at the Wee Kirk of the Heather Chapel in Glendale. For a while, it seemed like a Hollywood fairy tale. Two young actors building careers together, supporting each other through the ups and downs of studio life. Jane had a daughter, Maureen, in 1941. They adopted a son, Michael, in 1945. From the outside, it looked like the perfect Hollywood family. The handsome actor husband, the pretty actress wife, 2 children, the house in the hills. Warner Brothers publicity loved them, used them in fan magazines as examples of how movie stars could have normal, happy marriages. But underneath, tensions were already forming that would eventually tear everything apart. Reagan was becoming increasingly interested in politics, in the Screen Actors Guild, in union negotiations and anti-communist rhetoric that consumed more and more of his attention and energy. He'd come home from the studio and want to talk about labor disputes, about the communist infiltration of Hollywood, about political ideology and philosophical abstractions. Jane wanted to talk about scripts and performances and career opportunities, about the practical business of being an actress in a competitive industry. The divide wasn't just about different interests. It was about fundamentally different ways of seeing the world. Jane was an artist, focused on the emotional truth of performance, on finding authentic ways to convey human experience. Reagan was increasingly drawn to politics as performance, to rhetoric and ideology, to the grand narratives of freedom and tyranny rather than the messy particulars of individual lives. She lived in specifics. He lived in abstractions. She cried for characters. He speechified about principles. And there was something else. Something Jane probably couldn't articulate even to herself at the time. Reagan's ego was growing as his political involvement increased, and he wasn't comfortable being married to someone more successful than himself. Jane was getting better roles, earning more money, receiving more critical attention. Her career was ascending while his remained stuck in B pictures and supporting roles. For a man who would later prove to have substantial ambitions for himself, being Mr. Jane Wyman wasn't a role that fit comfortably. Then came June 26, 1947, and everything changed. Jane gave birth to Christine Reagan 3 months premature, a tiny baby weighing only 4 pounds. The doctors worked frantically. Jane held her daughter, held her once, maybe twice, felt the impossibly small weight of her. Saw the tiny face that looked so much like Maureen had at birth. And then, after just one day of struggling to breathe, to exist in a world her body wasn't ready for, Christine's heart stopped beating. One day. That's all Jane got. 24 hours of being Christine's mother before becoming a mother who'd lost a child. Before joining the club nobody wants to join, the one where you carry grief that has no expiration date, no acceptable timeline for recovery, no socially approved way to express how it tears you apart from the inside. Hollywood applauded me for tears on screen, but no one clapped when I cried at home. Jane said this about Christine's death, and the statement reveals everything about what that loss meant and how impossible it was to process publicly. She was an actress trained to cry on cue, praised for her ability to convey emotion with perfect control. She could produce tears for any director who asked, could calibrate precisely how much grief to show for maximum dramatic impact. But when real grief struck, the kind that destroys you from the inside, that makes you question whether you can continue existing, that has no script and no director calling cut, nobody knew how to respond except to look away, to give her space, to treat her pain like a private matter that shouldn't burden others. The studio gave her 2 weeks off, 2 weeks to recover from giving birth and losing a child, to somehow process the loss of a daughter she'd carried for 6 months, had dreamed about, had imagined growing up alongside Maureen and Michael. 2 weeks before they expected her back on set, smiling for publicity photos, promoting whatever picture was coming out, being Jane Wyman the actress rather than Jane Wyman the grieving mother who wanted to scream that nothing mattered anymore. That her baby was dead and the world kept turning as if that wasn't the most important thing that had ever happened. Reagan tried to help, but he didn't know how. Grief frightened him, not just Christine's death, but Jane's grief, the depth and intensity of it, the way it consumed her and wouldn't let go. He retreated into politics, into SAG meetings, into the work that made sense to him because personal grief didn't, because you couldn't negotiate with death or give it a speech about American values and expect it to change its mind. Jane retreated into silence, into the kind of profound isolation that comes when the worst thing imaginable happens. And you realize nobody can help. Nobody can fix it. Nobody can bring back what you've lost. And most people don't even know what to say, so they say nothing at all. The marriage that had been drifting before Christine's death now had a canyon between them. Grief on one side, political obsession on the other, and no bridge that could span the distance. Jane was drowning in loss. Reagan was drowning in committee meetings. They were in the same house but living in completely different worlds, speaking different languages, needing things from each other that neither could provide. Behind the Hollywood glamour, the premieres and photo shoots and happy family images they still projected for the public, was their unbearable pain nobody saw. When tragedy strikes and your partner can't meet you in your grief, when you're drowning and the person beside you doesn't even notice you're underwater. Is there any recovery, or is the relationship already dead, just taking time to admit it? And when you lose a child, but the world expects you to keep smiling, keep working, keep being the pretty actress with the perfect life, at what point does the performance of normalcy become more exhausting than the grief itself? In 1948, Jane filmed Johnny Belinda, a Warner Brothers drama directed by John Negulesco. She played Belinda McDonald, a deaf-mute farm girl in a remote Nova Scotia fishing village who is raped, becomes pregnant, gives birth, and fights to keep her child when the town's respectable citizens try to take the baby away. It was a role that required no dialogue, just physical performance, emotional truth conveyed entirely through expression and gesture and presence. Jane threw herself into the role with an intensity that went beyond professional commitment. She studied sign language, worked with deaf consultants, learned to move and communicate as someone who had never heard sound. But more than technique, She brought her own grief to Belinda, the pain of losing a child, the rage at being powerless to protect what you love, the isolation of suffering that can't be spoken. She wasn't just playing Belinda, she was channeling every ounce of pain from Christine's death into a performance that would transcend the melodrama of the script and become something raw and real. The performance was extraordinary. Critics who had previously dismissed Jane as just another pretty contract player suddenly recognized her as a serious actress. The role earned her the Oscar, making her the first performer to win for a non-speaking role, proving that the most profound emotions sometimes transcend words entirely. But there was something almost too personal about her performance, as if Jane was using Belinda's silence to express her own voicelessness, using Belinda's fight for her child to process the child she couldn't fight for, couldn't save, couldn't keep. Did the Oscar represent artistic triumph or desperate sublimation? When you pour your real grief into a performance and get applauded for how beautifully you suffer, have you processed your pain or just made it entertaining for others? And when the role that wins you the highest honor is one where you cannot speak, is that recognition of your talent, or is it the universe telling you that your voice, your story, your suffering only matters when it's performed for others' consumption rather than expressed for your own healing? By the time she accepted that Oscar in March 1949, Jane's marriage to Reagan was effectively over. They announced their divorce in June, Jane filing on grounds of mental cruelty, which in 1940s Hollywood parlance meant irreconcilable differences. Reagan would later claim he never understood why the marriage failed, that Jane's decision to divorce him came as a shock. But Jane knew. She'd lost a daughter and gained a husband who cared more about SAG meetings than sitting with his wife's grief. She'd achieved artistic recognition while he was still playing second leads. The dynamic had shifted, and Reagan, whose ego would prove quite substantial in later years, couldn't handle being married to someone more successful, someone who needed him emotionally while he could only offer political speeches. Jane never publicly discussed the real reasons for the divorce. She maintained dignified silence, refusing to criticize Reagan even as she moved on with her life. This silence would define her for decades, an unwillingness to explain herself, to justify her choices, to engage with public narratives about her life. Some called it class, others called it repression. Jane simply called it survival. Through the 1950s, Jane established herself as Hollywood's queen of melodrama, the woman who could cry more beautifully than anyone else on screen. She worked with director Douglas Sirk on Magnificent Obsession, 1954, and All That Heaven Allows, 1955, films that elevated soap opera to the level of art, that used the conventions of women's pictures to critique the very society that produced them. In Magnificent Obsession, she played a blind widow who falls in love with the reckless playboy responsible for her husband's death. In All That Heaven Allows, she was a middle-aged widow who scandalizes her small-town community by falling in love with her younger gardener. Both roles required Jane to convey suffering with grace, to embody women trapped by social expectations, to make audiences weep for characters who could never quite achieve the happiness they deserved. These were the roles Jane excelled at. Suffering women, women who endured, women who sacrificed their desires for propriety or duty or the comfort of others. And Jane brought to them an authenticity that transcended the melodramatic scripts because she understood suffering. She knew what it meant to lose what mattered most. She lived daily with grief that couldn't be expressed because nobody wanted to hear about it. The scene in All That Heaven Allows, where Jane's character receives a television as a Christmas gift from her children, a television meant to be a substitute for the love and companionship she's been denied, defined melodrama for a generation. The camera holds on her face as she realizes this is what her life has become, watching other people's stories because her own happiness is unacceptable to those around her. Jane didn't need dialogue for that moment. Her face said everything about loneliness, about resignation, about the quiet death of hope. Hollywood gave me fame, but not happiness. Jane said this during her melodrama years, and it captured the disconnect between her screen success and her personal life. She was playing women who couldn't have what they wanted, and she was living that same reality off-screen. The Oscar was on her shelf. The ex-husband was building a political career. The dead daughter was still dead. Fame couldn't fix any of it. Can an artist pour real pain into commercial entertainment without diminishing either the pain or the art? Or does that kind of emotional authenticity transform melodrama into something that transcends its genre, making suffering visible even when it can't be spoken? And if you become known as the woman who cries most beautifully on screen, does that recognition honor your depth or reduce your pain to a marketable skill? Something studios can sell to audiences hungry for catharsis they can watch from a safe distance. Reagan remarried in 1952. Nancy Davis, an actress whose greatest role would be as his wife. They would stay married until his death in 2004, a union held up as a model of devotion and partnership. And Jane? Jane remained single, dated occasionally but never remarried after 2 more failed marriages to other men. She focused on work, on her children, on maintaining the privacy that had become her fortress against a world that wanted her to be either Reagan's ex-wife or the crying woman from the movies. As Reagan's political career ascended, Governor of California in 1967, President of the United States in 1981, Jane was increasingly defined in relation to him. Magazine articles would describe her as Ronald Reagan's ex-wife, Oscar winner Jane Wyman, as if the ex-wife designation mattered more than the Oscar. Reporters would ask her to comment on Reagan's politics, his presidency, his relationship with Nancy. Jane refused every time. "It's not my concern," she would say. "I have my own life," but the silence wasn't indifference. Those close to Jane said she followed Reagan's career, that she cared about his success even if she could never be part of it. That some part of her heart remained attached to the young man she'd married in 1940, even if she couldn't stay married to the man he'd become. When Reagan was shot in 1981, Jane was quietly devastated, calling Nancy to offer support but refusing all media requests. When he announced his Alzheimer's diagnosis in 1994, Jane wept in private but said nothing publicly. Even when he died in 2004, 3 years before her own death, Jane's public statement was brief and dignified. "America has lost a great president and a great, kind, and gentle man." Did Jane's silence about Reagan protect her privacy, or ensure she'd be forever defined by a marriage that ended decades before he became president? When you refuse to tell your own story, does that preserve dignity, or allow others to write your narrative in ways that diminish you? And is there a difference between choosing silence and having silence chosen for you? Between protecting yourself through withholding and being erased because nobody asks the right questions, nobody cares about your answer, nobody sees past the convenient label of ex-wife to recognize the artist who won the Oscar, who created the performances, who had her own story worth telling? In 1981, the same year Reagan became president, Jane made an unexpected comeback. She was cast as Angela Channing in Falcon Crest, a primetime soap opera about wealthy California wine families that would run for 9 seasons. Jane was 64 when the show premiered, an age when most actresses are considered finished in Hollywood. But Angela Channing wasn't a sweet grandmother or a dignified matriarch. She was ruthless, manipulative, powerful. A woman who fought for control and refused to be marginalized by age or society's expectations. Jane threw herself into the role with the same intensity she'd brought to Johnny Belinda. Angela was everything Jane wasn't in real life. Loud, confrontational, unafraid to demand what she wanted. Playing her gave Jane a kind of freedom, a chance to be powerful and visible after years of living quietly. Falcon Crest was silly and melodramatic, but Angela Channing became iconic, and Jane earned multiple Golden Globe nominations for the role. The show ran until 1990, giving Jane 9 years as one of television's most memorable villains. At 73, when Falcon Crest ended, Jane retired from acting permanently. She'd had enough of the spotlight, enough of being public. She retreated to her Rancho Mirage home, tended her garden, played piano, saw her children and grandchildren, and lived the quiet life she'd wanted all along. The final 17 years of Jane's life were lived almost entirely in private. A withdrawal so complete it was as if she'd decided to become the silence she'd spent decades perfecting. She made no public appearances, gave no interviews, refused all requests to discuss her career or her marriages or her ex-husband, the president. She'd always been private, but this was something more. A complete severing from the public world. A choice to exist without needing recognition or attention or the validation that fame provides. Friends who visited her in those final years described a woman at peace, finally, with her choices. She tended her garden with the same focus she'd once brought to performances, each plant chosen carefully, nurtured patiently, blooming according to its own timeline rather than the demands of a studio schedule. She played piano daily, classical pieces mostly, Chopin and Debussy, music that required no words, that expressed what language couldn't. She saw her children and grandchildren, maintained relationships with the people who'd known her before she became Jane Wyman, who remembered Sarah Jane Mayfield and the girl who'd fought so hard to become someone else. But there was also something elegiac about those years, as if Jane was simultaneously living and remembering living, present but also observing her own presence from a distance. She'd watch her old films on television sometimes, Johnny Belinda, All That Heaven Allows, and friends said she'd critique her performances with the detachment of a stranger, noting technique and choices without any apparent connection to the woman who'd made them. As if Jane Wyman, the actress, was someone she'd played for decades, a role she'd finally retired from, and now she could examine that performance objectively without being implicated in it. She kept scrapbooks from her career but rarely looked at them. The Oscar sat on a shelf, dusty, just another object in a house full of objects. Tracy Ellis Ross, her daughter from her second marriage, had inherited show business ambitions and would go on to considerable success, but Jane didn't attend premieres or award shows to support her. She sent flowers, made phone calls, expressed pride privately. But the public world of Hollywood had become foreign territory, a place she'd once inhabited but no longer recognized as having any claim on her. When Ronald Reagan died in June 2004 after a long decline into Alzheimer's, Jane grieved however she grieved, privately, without cameras, without commentary. The news coverage of his death was enormous, a state funeral befitting a former president, tributes from world leaders, retrospectives of his life and legacy. Nancy Reagan was everywhere in those images, the devoted widow, the woman who'd stood beside him through everything. And Jane? Jane sent flowers, released a brief statement, and remained in Rancho Mirage, alone with whatever memories or regrets or peace she'd made with a marriage that ended 55 years earlier. Did those final years represent freedom or defeat? Was Jane finally living authentically, freed from the demands of public performance, or was she simply disappeared, erased, forgotten, except as a footnote in someone else's story? Can you choose invisibility, or does invisibility eventually choose you whether you want it or not? On September 10, 2007, Jane Wyman died at age 90 in her Rancho Mirage home. The cause was given as natural causes, the peaceful end to a long life lived largely on her own terms. The obituaries were respectful. They mentioned the Oscar, the Douglas Sirk films, Falcon Crest, her status as a Hollywood legend. But they all also mentioned Ronald Reagan, often in the first paragraph, identifying her first as his ex-wife before acknowledging her own accomplishments. There was no public funeral, No memorial service, no opportunity for Hollywood to gather and celebrate her legacy. Jane had requested privacy even in death, and her family honored that wish. She was cremated, her ashes scattered. No grave for fans to visit, no physical marker of her existence except the films and television shows that remained. The legacy Jane Wyman leaves is massive but somehow hidden, like everything about her life. She was one of Hollywood's greatest actresses, capable of conveying profound emotion through silence and expression alone. She proved a woman could win an Oscar without speaking a word, could carry films through the sheer power of her presence. She opened doors for actresses who wanted to be taken seriously as artists rather than just pretty faces. She survived personal tragedy. Dead daughter, failed marriages, decades of being overshadowed by an ex-husband's success with a dignity that never cracked publicly. But her legacy is also defined by what she wouldn't say, wouldn't explain, wouldn't share. Her silence protected her but also ensured that her story would be told through absence, through what she refused to reveal rather than what she chose to express. She played suffering women so well because she was one, but unlike the characters in her films, Jane never got the cathartic breakdown scene, never got to explain her pain, never got recognition for the real suffering versus the performed version. Silence can be a shield, and sometimes a prison. Jane said this, and she lived it. Every single day from the moment she learned as a child that expressing need led to abandonment, through the years of crying beautifully on screen while crying alone at home, until the final silent years when she simply stopped trying to make anyone understand. The silence that protected her privacy also trapped her in narratives written by others. The Oscar she won for playing a voiceless character became prophetic. She'd spent her life unable or unwilling to speak for herself in the ways that might have secured her own story, her own legacy separate from the men she'd been married to or the melodramas she'd starred in. When you choose silence to protect yourself from a world that doesn't want to hear your pain, at what point does that silence stop being protection and become complicity in your own erasure? Can dignity and invisibility coexist? Or are they just different words for the same surrender? She's been gone since 2007, but her films remain. Johnny Belinda, The Yearling, All That Heaven Allows, Magnificent Obsession, testaments to an actress who could break your heart without saying a word. The woman who won an Oscar for silence, who spent her life choosing silence, who died in silence and was mourned in silence, the silent queen of Hollywood. The woman who taught us that suffering doesn't need words to be profound, that some pain is too deep for dialogue, that sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is nothing at all. But she also taught us, perhaps without meaning to, that silence can protect and erase simultaneously, that dignity and invisibility aren't opposites but sometimes the same thing, that you can win every professional battle and still lose the war for your own narrative. Jane Wyman survived abandonment, survived Hollywood, survived being forgotten while her ex-husband became immortal, survived losing a child and 3 marriages and decades of being introduced as someone's ex-wife rather than as herself. But survival isn't the same as happiness, isn't the same as feeling that your story was told fairly, isn't the same as knowing that people saw you for who you really were rather than who they needed you to be. Jane survived by becoming untouchable, by maintaining distance, by never explaining or justifying or revealing the real woman behind the performances. And maybe that was strength, the strength to endure without needing validation, to grieve without needing witnesses, to live without needing the world's approval. Or maybe it was the saddest role she ever played, the woman who won an Oscar for not speaking and then spent 60 more years proving that silence can be both shield and prison, both protection and erasure, both dignity and disappearance. Hollywood gave her an Oscar. History gave her a footnote. She gave herself privacy, dignity, and a silence that would outlast everything except the films where she suffered so beautifully that audiences forgot she was acting. Forgot she was a person with her own suffering that nobody ever applauded, nobody ever recognized as worthy of an award. Jane Wyman won an Oscar for silence, and then lived the rest of her life proving that silence can both protect and erase, that the same fortress that keeps pain out can also keep truth in, that the dignity of not explaining yourself can become indistinguishable from allowing yourself to be defined by others. That sometimes the most tragic performances are the ones we give off screen when nobody's watching. When there's no director to yell cut and no script to tell us when the suffering finally ends, the silent queen is gone. But the silence remains, as permanent and revealing as anything she might have said if she'd ever chosen to speak, or if anyone had ever truly listened.